So we need to stop teaching children that obedience is their greatest virtue, especially as we brace for the possibility of more systemic racial devastation. We need young people who push boundaries and become the kinds of adults who will not let themselves be victimized. That's what Dr. Bunley was saying this morning. That's what Kate Wise Whitehead was saying this morning, and that's what Dr. Lisa Williams was talking about. The violence that black children experience from trigger-happy cops in the street of cities like Baltimore and Chicago, in schools and at home, is all interconnected. It is all strange and bitter fruit from the same tree. I am asking that black parents stop assisting in the devaluation of our children. Instead, we must make black childhood the antidote to centuries of racism. That's the sister here, y'all. That's who's coming up on the stage in a few minutes to give it up. And I told her already that her name is already on the FBI list, so she can speak truth to power. Dr. Williams, your name is on the list. You know, Dr. Bunley, your name is on the list. Your name is on the list. Just know that. You've been doing this work for a long time. You've been speaking truth to power for a long time. Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, your name is on the list. David Miller, your name is on the list. So come today and give us our marching orders. We want to hear you all speak truth to power and tell us what we need to do, so there's nobody in this room who leaves today and says, I don't know what to do. There's nobody who leaves this summit today, Jan, and says, well, what should we do? Now, if you don't want to read from Dr. Newton and follow her on, and go to all the websites. Again, they didn't talk about the websites. They're very humble. They don't really, talk themselves up. I want to applaud them. I went to Dr. Patton's website last night. Her website has stuff on there like she has a parent link. So if you have questions about parenting, she has a link on her website about that. She has a link about pledging. She has everything there that we all need in order to move our agenda forward. Again, I've got to stop because folks know that I'll get up here, there's lights, there's cameras, and there's a microphone. I'll get up here and talk all day, and I don't want to do that. So again, I'm going to bring these three powerful, brilliant people to the stage right now. Let them share with you in their presentations what we must begin to do, what we should be doing, and how we should be doing this very, very important work to value our children and in turn and make certain that black childhood, I love this quote, instead we must make black childhood the antidote to centuries of racism. Racism ain't going nowhere, y'all. It ain't going nowhere. We got to lean all the way in. And if I wasn't in church, I would use a few expletives so y'all would get the message. We got to lean in, y'all, all the way in to make certain that nobody devalues our children, our women, our elderly ever again. And so that's this important work that the Black Mental Health Alliance is trying to do. We need you all's help. Can't do it by ourselves. We need you all's help. So
good afternoon, everybody. I have to say first that I'm extremely honored to be on this panel with these two incredible people. I've worked with David for a couple of years when I was a community school coordinator, and I've been following you and the work that you've been doing around spanking. I love it. The article in the New York Times was pretty on point. I really enjoyed that. I like to, when we talk about trauma, I actually don't like talking about trauma. I rather talk about resiliency. The fact that we, as a people, young people, black people, people of color, have been resilient for so long. We have made a way out of no way. We constantly make a way out of no way, right? But in making a way out of no way, and I didn't even kind of go into who I am and what I do, but I just feel so strongly about the fact that, trauma and the word trauma has become such a catchphrase lately that everybody's using it, right? But no one is talking about the fact that people are growing and building out of the concrete that they're living in. And so I don't know, that's just really important to me, that we really address the fact and we really celebrate the fact that young people and black people and people of color are extremely resilient, have really grown. Now, when it comes to the work, right? When it comes to the work, it falls on us. It falls on everyone to support that resiliency and to support that, and to celebrate the resiliency that so many young people in our communities are showing. Right now, I'm the program manager for Recast Baltimore, which is a program that's coming through SAMHSA to support communities that have suffered civil unrest. So pretty much we got some money from the feds after Freddie Gray. Money that we could have probably used a long time ago, but not until the rocket blew, then folks really wanted to pay attention to Sandtown, Penn North, Upton, and Druid Heights. It's been going on for years. If you live in Baltimore, you know what's been going on, right? But not until the kettle blew did the country start paying attention to what's going on. So our program is basically servicing young people 16 to 24 and building capacity in the programs that are the small CBOs that are in those communities, servicing those young people, but then also working with those young people to build capacity in themselves and to create some programs of their own. For a long time, I was a community school coordinator at Westside, well, the old Westside Elementary School, which is now John Edgar Howard. I led the fight in trying to keep our school open, because one thing that Baltimore City Schools didn't realize is that when you merge schools, you merge communities. Even though there might be a block that separates those two communities, you know Baltimore is a neighborhood kind of city, that one block is night and the other block is day. And funny thing is that we were at a meeting yesterday afternoon at City Schools, and I brought the question up that when will somebody kind of address trauma when you're thinking about those mergers? You know, like right now what's happening at John Edgar Howard and Westside, the suspension rate is much higher than what it ever has been between when it was two schools. The families are constantly fighting. There's a constant strife that's going on there, and it'll keep on happening as long as City School never pays attention to it and keeps on merging schools. So I guess my takeaways, right, which I have to give takeaways. So my takeaways is just to kind of follow the work. I kind of tell folks that all the time, to kind of follow the politics, to kind of follow where the money is going, because money is constantly coming into the city, but folks aren't talking. Money's just kind of being thrown because sometimes folks aren't expecting anything to happen with that money. So follow the money. If you have time in your day, volunteer in your neighborhood, volunteer in your school, thank you. Volunteer in schools in your community. The real deal is that there is a divide also with young and old, and I think that sometimes it takes us as the older folks, as adults, to reach out to young people. They're not really expecting that to happen, but to reach out in a way that is not shaming or degrading, but in a supportive way. And that's really that's all I have for you guys today. I'll pass it over to my colleagues.
Good afternoon. How y'all doing? Y'all all right? So this is going to be difficult for some of y'all. I'm just going to say that already. You bring that up, brother, then I'm good. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the Black Mental Health Alliance for even allowing me. Is that going to advance? Try that. For even allowing me to be here. I think that they moved from one screen to another. Okay, you go back. I want to thank Jan and her team for allowing me to be here, because anybody that knows me knows I've been put out of a lot of places, churches, synagogues, mosques. I got some folks here from my church, so I'm going to try to be on my best behavior. One thing that Richard said to me, this thing is going to be held in the church, so you cannot curse. That's my biggest vice. Y'all pray for me. A couple things, and I know Jan is going to give me the signal when I need to wrap up. No one is coming to save us, y'all. No one is coming. We are the people that our ancestors prayed for. No one's coming to save us, right? I was going to show a video, but I'm not going to show the video because Dr. Patton is going to go last, and she's got a video that's super important to her presentation. But there's a scene in 12 Years a Slave that I was going to show y'all, where the brother is hanging from a rope, and his toes are barely touching the ground, and folk are just walking by, involved in normal activity, as if nothing is wrong. Yesterday, I was up on the corner of Ricestown and Cold Spring, maybe 5 blocks from where my parents live, my childhood home. 17-year-old girl was shot in the head. They got a memorial up on the corner. 17-year-old girl shot in the head. People just walking by. I'm in tears. People just walking by, involved in normal and daily activity. And so let me see who's in the room really quickly. Where are my professional Negroes? Stand up if you're a professional Negro. That's about 60% of y'all in here, but I notice ain't nobody stand up. All right, so I'm sorry, Richard. I told Richard and Jan I was going to be on my best behavior. I've been on that FBI list for a long time. Here we go. There isn't a preacher, and I want y'all to type this in y'all phones. If you got a flip phone, we'll work it out later. There isn't a preacher or an elected official that can clean this stuff up. There isn't a preacher or an elected official that can clean this thing up. Either we going to do it, and it's not going to happen. Really quickly, there's a story in the paper, Dr. Lisa Williams, and we go way back. We were at Calverton Middle School a bunch of years ago, and we basically said to the new principal, you going to leave before we going to leave because we not allowing it to happen on our watch. We told a little white man, we'll get rid of you before we let these children run us out of here, right? My presentation is really going to look at images, because as Dr. Newton shared, oftentimes we are being destroyed by images. And so I want to run through a couple of things, and then I'll probably yield my remaining time to Dr. Patton. Ethnic Notions, developing a blueprint for culturally empowering children's books. One of the things that I've been doing is not only have I authored several children's books, but I'm working with a whole bunch of people across the country to try to ensure that our children see images of themselves. Because if I had more time, I could really kind of go through historically what has happened to us in terms of the images that have been developed to depict African people. And oftentimes, these images are very, very damaging. Many of these images you will find on postcards, pamphlets, early periodicals that came out right after Reconstruction. And what I would submit is oftentimes you still see a lot of these harmful images in children's books. One of the school districts that I'm working with is the Jackson Public Schools in Jackson, Mississippi. 99% African-American school district. 99% African-American school district. K-12, they only have 2 books written by African-American authors. And I would submit that is happening in most districts across the country. Who is in control of content and curriculum? It's some of us in this room, but we don't have the courage or the backbone to say anything, because we just like the cats in our neighborhood that are chasing dope. We just chasing something else, whether it's a Lexus or a certain kind of house payment. But we have become co-conspirators to our own demise. How do we have majority school districts where black folks are in positions of power, and you have summer reading lists where you have 1 or 2 black books on the reading list? But we want to win. Sprite used to have this commercial that image is everything. Our children don't even see themselves in the text. And we talk a lot about culturally responsive pedagogy. And we having all of these anti-racism workshops, and like we need to sit down with white people and we need to have these conversations about how we need to deal with race, right? We have diversity workshops in schools. But how can we even talk about diversity or equity when we don't even have black children's books in schools? So I'm gonna give y'all some takeaways. I'm going to give you all some takeaways in a few minutes. But these images, these historical images, I just want y'all to think about it. I want this to sink in for a second, right? The images that our children and we have historically seen depicting us as a people. And the fact that when somebody earlier talked about reality television, the Housewives of Atlanta, the Housewives of Baltimore, they don't have that out yet, Dr. Bunley, but I'm sure it's coming. Love and Hip Hop, right? All of these insane shows that depict these negative. So you got to look at mass media, and then we also got to look at literature. Mass media and literature. So here's where we are in terms of children's books, right? When we talk about diversity in children's books, there was a study done a couple of years ago at the University of Wisconsin that really provided us with a greater understanding of how racist even the children's book industry is. Most principals and school superintendents exclusively order their books from Scholastic. Scholastic has probably about less than 10 black authors in their network, maybe 10. I know most of them. And so most of the time when schools order books, they order books from Scholastic. And they got some good folks at Scholastic. The president of Scholastic's educational section is a brother. His name is Greg Worrell. They got some other African Americans, Andrea Pinkney. They got some good folks out there. But the challenge remains that the vast majority of school districts order books, and these books do not represent who we are as a people. And oftentimes you will be blown away by the number of people who are non-African American, who are writing African American children's books and putting black faces on the covers of the books. 7.6% of all children's books published in 2015 by African Americans. 73% of the books published in the children's books in this country that are published by white folks. %80 of all children's book authors, illustrators, editors, executives, marketers, anybody who has anything to do with children's books, 5 more minutes? Wow, are non-people of color. Okay, man, I'm just getting started, Jan. All right, so here's 2 books really quickly that I want to share with you. A Fine Dessert, written by Emily Jenkins, illustrated by Sophie Blackall, both white, portrayed an enslaved woman and her daughter serving dessert on a South Carolina plantation. This is a relatively recent book. I think it came out in 2016. A Birthday Cake from George Washington, illustrated by a sister that I know, right? Vanessa Brantley Newton. This was written by, two people of color. The story talked about a man who he was enslaved house cook for President George Washington. This was published through Scholastic. I know I need to wrap up. Only 12% of black boys in this country are proficient in reading by 8th grade. Only 12% of our boys are proficient in reading by 8th grade based on data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Only 12% of our boys are proficient in reading by 8th grade. We got to deal with this issue of literacy, right? And there are a whole host of independent authors. I'm an independent children's book author. Mark Booker is one over here. There are some phenomenal books written by black and Latino authors that we don't even consider using. Another book that just recently came out, this brother wrote an amazing book, which is sort of a letter to young people about how black girls need to be treated, right? But you won't find this book in school districts. You won't find this book in school districts. I'm wrapping up, Jan. These are some other books, mainly by people that, I've met or have a great relationship. Kwame Alexander, the book Crossover, New York Times bestseller. He's a brother that lives in Virginia. He was just fortunate enough to get a major publishing deal. His book is New York Times bestsellers list. Jason Reynolds, Jacqueline Woodson, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has written some books. But you won't find a lot of these books in our public schools. Just a couple of other things let me just give you 4 things that I think that we have to do. Number one, we got to celebrate the power of connecting black children to books written by black authors. Every year I do a project in Jackson, Mississippi that's funded through Kellogg, because I couldn't get the money in the city of Jackson, so I had to go to Kellogg Foundation. Every year we do a project, a Young Men of Color Reading Challenge, where we award and have a special ceremony for young men who are able to score proficient on the Mississippi State Assessment in the area of reading. And so I just gave away 1,200 black books in Jackson, Mississippi to 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade boys who responded to the challenge. So we know that our boys and our girls want to see themselves in the literature. Second, support independent black authors through purchasing books. One of the challenges, really quickly, 50% of the black bookstores have gone out of business in 10 years, right? A lot of times we buy street fiction. You know, Dr. Newton was talking about Dr. John Howard Clark. I could tell some of y'all looking around like, I don't even know who the hell she's talking about. Because even as adults, we not reading, right? Use culturally relevant text to get black students excited about literacy, host book events featuring children's book by black authors. And last but not least, this is just one of the images of one of the boys that was awarded books. I want to tell y'all as I close, this issue of literacy is major. This issue of images is major. What I would say to each and every one of you in this room, buy some books by black authors and just give them to young people. Because this issue of literacy is directly connected to achievement. And the last thing that I want to say really quickly, Jan, I know you give me the eye. They had an article in the paper about this young brother, and they called him public enemy number 1. Did y'all see that? Young black boy. I would submit that while he may have done some heinous act, the school system is public enemy number 1. The school system is public enemy number 1, right? Another recent article that came out, 8 schools in Baltimore, not one student in any of those schools proficient in reading or math. 8 schools. And I know it's far more than 8 schools. There's probably 70 of them. They said in the newspaper, 8 schools, Frederick Douglass being one of them, there ain't a damn student in the building, I'm sorry, Richard, that's not proficient in reading or math. In the entire school, nobody is proficient in reading or math. And so how come we're not really looking at what's actually happening in the school system when they're spending all of this money? They could give me, Dr. Bunley, Dr. Wally Gill, they could give us a couple $1 million, give us the school. We'll turn it around. But we're gonna do it our way.
People have been parenting, legally parenting their children for only 150 years. Now, if you factor in Jim Crow, it's only 50 years. Toya Graham was not a hero for chasing down, cursing out, and assaulting her son on national television. Get the f*** over here. But I empathized with her fear. I understood why she needed to intervene in that moment. What I was disgusted by was the media circus created by it. We need you to be a mammy, that bridge between the interests of a white authority and your thug son.
Black people hit their child 92 times. In the eye, in the nuts, in the feet. That's where the real pop locking came from.
I will fuck a kid up. Don't get mad at me. I'm just saying what you can't say. You feel the same goddamn way I feel.
Wait. Why are you crying? Okay, listen.
If you check the latest statistics from the Department of Health and Human Services, last year alone, black women, black parents put 375 children in their graves as a result of child abuse. A disproportionate number of the perpetrators are black women aged 40 and under. We need to deal with that reality.
It was love, and I want to really show that he's not a gang. You know, we don't compromise.
Tonight, the uncle of a slain teenager defends what he calls an act of love. The Terrytown teen made internet headlines after he was seen being disciplined by his uncle for claiming to be a gangster just last week. The young man was shot to death outside of his home.
Tell him about that. Tell him that. Tell him, show him that. Show him that. Facebook that. The gang member, huh? No, no, we last night too, huh? Bring him or stomp your motherfucking ass.
Toya Graham and legions of other black men and women are parenting their children under a racist system that is designed to distort and destroy and kill their kids. So what we have to stop doing as black people is, becoming co-conspirators and participants in the dehumanization process.
I don't spank. I whoops. Yes, I was whooped, therefore I shall whoop.
Okay. Bend over. Bend over. Mommy, please grab myself. So one more word. Say it.
I just published a new book called Spare the Kids, Why Whooping Children Won't Save Black America. And what I've learned through my work all these years is that black people have long argued that whooping children is part of responsible and loving black parenting, and that it will save our children from the streets, from an early grave, from prisons. But if beating children was so successful at keeping black people out of prisons, then we would not be having national discussions about mass incarceration. If whooping children were a prerequisite for success, then black people should be ruling the world right now. We believe that it builds character and resilience and will prepare our children for the harsh realities of racism in America. But what I've also learned through my work is that hitting, spanking, whooping, popping, whatever semantics we want to engage in to call the violence what it is actually the whitest and most effective thing that you can do to destroy a black child intellectually, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. A lot of people I hear say that whooping children is a black thing. It might be prevalent in our communities, but it is not native to our culture. It is not intuitive to our culture. It is a byproduct of slavery and colonialism and religious indoctrination into Christianity. I hear black people say, well, we bought whooping over from Africa. And I say, how do you know this? They just assume that this was part of our culture. These are the same people who will say things like they stole our religions, they stole our culture, they stole our languages, they stole everything, but whooping children survived the Middle Passage. The fact is, the majority of the captives who disembarked from West Africa were children and teenagers. When we get close to the 19th century, when the slave trade, the ban on international trade was imminent, the average age was somewhere between 8 and 12 years old. So this is an enterprise that was built upon the exploitation and destruction of young people. Those young people who came here had not completed childhood. Many of them had not been parents, okay? So they didn't come here with a universal blueprint for parenting. Now, if they had all come from the same villages, spoke the same languages, practiced the same religions, held the same conceptions of childhood, and when they got here in other parts of the diaspora and parenting was not interfered with by whites, then maybe we could make the argument that whooping was something that we brought over from Africa, but it's simply not true. There's absolutely no evidence that whipping children existed in West African cultures prior to the arrival of Europeans and their Bibles. We weren't even reading Bibles, yet today African Americans are quick to cite spare the rod, spoil the child, to legitimize beating their kids. What I've also learned is that white supremacy is about destroying black life at every single turn. And the first logical step in that process is to seize and destroy black children. And the greatest, most diabolical trick is to get their parents and caretakers to participate in the dehumanization process and call it love and protection. The denial of innocence to black children and the acceleration of black children into perceived maturity is a hallmark of anti-blackness. I want to take you through a few slides very quickly. You all remember the Adrian Peterson controversies and the famous Baltimore mom controversy as well. After Toya Graham went upside her son's head in the middle of a race riot, she was declared an international hero. And it sent a message to black parents everywhere that this is what responsible black parenting looks like. On any other day, she may have been arrested for this, or social services would have been involved. Okay? But America loves a black mammy, a good black mammy, who can keep her thug sons in line. And after that, we saw an uptick in something called digi-punishment. Parents who picked up their cell phones and shamed their kids on social media. The young man below, his father put on a pair of boxing gloves because he skipped out of school, and he decided to punch him until his face opened up on Facebook Live. So we see scenes like this. I'm just going to go through very quickly. Parents shaming their kids for bad report cards, lying about their age on social media, twerking, even though twerking was something that was invented by Africans throughout the diaspora, talking to boys, things like that, skipping class. And so parents share these things, and they get millions of shares, millions of likes, and people call this good parenting. Some parents have actually been arrested for doing this sort of thing. And so in these discussions, you see all kinds of commentary about black children. These kids today are so bad. These kids today are out of control. Even though all the studies show that millennials drink less, they do fewer drugs, they're more spiritual actually. School violence is actually down, okay? And so you see this very dysfunctional conversation happening around black children. And so you can see how white supremacist thinking and ideology moves through black bodies and perceptions of our own children. I do this work on child abuse prevention. I've been traveling across the country for about a decade now talking about this issue. And I can't talk about it without talking about the statistics. So I hear a lot of black people say, if I don't whoop my child, then the police will beat them or the police will kill them. First of all, police officers shouldn't be beating and killing children to begin with. But let's look at the data. So we can all talk about Tamir Rice. We can talk about Mike Brown and a few others, Jordan, the most recent case. But I went and looked at the latest statistics for the past 10 years of child abuse fatalities in black communities. Over the past 10 years, black people have killed over 3,600 black children. That's an average rate each year of 360 children a year, okay? And that's a rate 3 times higher than all other racial groups. So when we put these numbers next to the data on police fatalities, the hard truth is, ladies and gentlemen, black children are more at risk of being seriously assaulted, injured, or killed by their own parents. And the biggest perpetrators of these fatalities are black women aged 40 and under. The other thing we have to talk about is paddling in public schools. People don't realize, so I hear a lot of black folks in our community say, well, our communities are in shambles because they made it a crime to discipline your kid. It's not true. It is legal in every single state to hit your child. Every state has a law to show you how to appropriately hit your kid's body. 19 states still allow corporal punishment with these wooden paddles in public schools. Most of them are in the South. Now, when you put the top 10 paddling schools, states, the states that hit kids the most, disproportionately black and disabled, they actually are the same states, almost identical, that were the top 10 lynching states in this country. So one form of social control is replaced by another. And a lot of people talk about corporal punishment in schools and say, oh, this is racist white people doing this to our kids, beating our kids. Actually, when you go district by district, this is happening in segregated schools where all the teachers are black, all the principals are black, All the administrators are black. So our own teachers and administrators, imbued with internalized racism themselves, in terms of their perceptions of black children, are helping to facilitate the flow of our children's bodies through the school-to-prison pipeline. And parents in these 19 states sign opt-in forms, giving administrators permission to do this to our children. I'm just going to skip over. These are some of the states that allow. This is the map that I was telling you about, the top 10 paddling states and the top lynching states where this goes on. People don't know also that every state in the country, with the exception of New Jersey and Iowa, still allow paddling in charter and private schools. Nearly 80% of Americans are hitting their kids. So maybe it's the hitting of the children that's counterintuitive and sowing the seeds for a lot of the problems that we see happening. We also see educational abuse without the paddle. So these charter schools in states like in northern states and in the District of Columbia, they're also subjecting black children to different types of violence. Maybe not with a paddle, but, sit down, be quiet, stand in line. They're subjecting our children to harsh psychological abuse in the classroom that they would never subject their own children to. And that's because too many black folks are buying into a modern day system of Jim Crow education. Signing opt-in forms in the South to beat our kids, subjecting our kids to emotional abuse in the classroom by people who have shrewdly listened to the ways in which we market our children as bad, as different, as needing to be coerced, as needing to be dealt with aggressively. And they have grafted that language into their marketing material. So they tell parents, we won't tolerate any of that in this school. But their outcomes are no better than the public schools that have been divested from. And then we have the school-to-prison pipeline and the foster care to prison pipeline. So when we whoop our kids, many people think that the folks who are abusing their kids or ending up killing them are sadistic monsters. No, they're not. I've interviewed district attorneys across this country and social workers across this country who will tell you that the parents who end up severely abusing their kids or killing them are folks who are just spanking them. And they hit too hard, or they hit in the wrong place just one time. Okay? And so when you hit your kid, you put them at risk for entering the foster care system. A foster care system where, since the late 1990s, the number of kids who are on psychotropic medications has risen exponentially. And the ones who are most vulnerable to this are black girls. Why? Because you have a predominantly white, middle-class, profession who comes into work with their perceived biases about blackness and black behavior. And so they see a sassy black girl who's not working with the system, and so she needs some medication. Not that this young girl has been traumatized and is grieving and is suffering from loss. So the emotional needs of black children are not being met when they end up in the foster care system. The foster care system is not designed, like the educational system, to empower our young people. It is yet another pathway to destruction. So they intervene in the name of saving our children from abuse, but at the end of the day, they end up putting them on the same path to jail, to early pregnancy, to bad educational outcomes, to homelessness, and to jail, and perpetuating the cycle all over again while these professions and these professionals continue to make money. Okay. So I'm going to stop right there because I know I don't have a lot of time. I got 5 minutes, so we're supposed to talk about some takeaways. So I want to shift because this panel is supposed to be about resilience, right? There's a whole cottage industry devoted to understanding the capacity of people of color to survive degradation over and over and over again. So what I'm thinking of is we have to talk about resilience in a different sort of way. Okay, that we often celebrate it. We celebrate black strength. Like I always hear people say to me, "You're a strong black woman," and I said, "No, I'm not. The strong black woman needs to die." Okay, because it becomes a weapon that gets used against us to deny us the full spectrum of our emotional lives and our humanity. It says anybody can do anything to you over and over again, and you will keep getting back up. The same thing happens in discussions in child welfare about our children. The same exact. How do we build resiliency in our children? But I think that therapists should, and other professionals should become more conversant on how racial trauma and poverty and chronic stress and internalized racism have left black children vulnerable to family violence. We need to start having those conversations. We need to start talking about white supremacy. A lot of conversations among professionals is about cultural competency. It's about, how do we understand those people out there? How do we understand why they do what they do? They're never prepared to have conversations about white supremacy and what's wrong with whiteness. I think we need to have conversations about how to foster resilience at a systemic level, because broken systems perpetuate brokenness, especially in marginalized communities, and how professionals can help in that conversation. We need to stop teaching resiliency as a coping mechanism for systemic problems. So our children need skill sets and systems that don't allow trauma and detriment to their lives in the first place. How do we fix those? Resilience, based on what I've seen, has become not just a positive character trait that we celebrate, but it functions as a prerequisite for survival. Discrimination does not give us a break. It does not allow us to come up to take air, a breath of air. I mean, when emancipation came, there weren't therapists standing at the edges of plantations ready to give us some therapy, to say, let's talk about the breakup of families. Let's talk about that rape you endured and all of these other things. But the imposition of strength and resilience is also a form of violence. The imposed strength is physical, it's emotional, it's psychological. It's about the capacity to withstand extreme trauma and abuse over and over again. This is what we celebrate, even though we're forced to navigate oppression daily. So we need to start talking about strength and resiliency, how much of it is too much, how much of it allows other people off the hook for making systemic changes. And just a few more things. Some of the work I've been doing in my travels across the country is teaching positive discipline techniques. We can't just say stop beating your kids and not replace it with something else. So we talk about positive parenting, painless parenting. We need to give our communities basic education about the science of child development and brain development. We need to talk about toxic stress. We need to talk about adverse childhood experiences and how they manifest themselves in the classroom and so on and so forth. Our preachers need to stop teaching spare the rod, spoil the child. Okay, first of all, spare the rod, spoil the child is not in the Bible. It's not there. Okay, we need to stop making comedy about whipping kids. Stop allowing our radio hosts to joke about it over and over again, because all that's part of an ecosystem of oppression and violence that our children take in. We need to stop recording and shaming our children on social media. Stop signing opt-in forms for kids to be beaten in public schools. Stop perpetuating the myth that beating kids will save them for all these systemic problems. And stop blaming our children for the systemic problems we as adults have not solved. Mass incarceration, deindustrialization, mass school closures, Wall Street corruption, community divestment, privatization of everything, gentrification, and so on and so forth. These issues should not be laid at the feet of the undisciplined black child's body. I got one more thing to say and I'll shut up. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to be willing to put our bodies on the line for our children. There is no way a school resource officer in South Carolina should have gotten away with throwing a foster child across a classroom and we didn't show up at the police station or at that officer's house, okay? We can't keep complaining in stories about teachers, suspending our kids because their hair grows out of their head a certain way. We have to show our children that we are willing to fight for them, okay? I hear people say, I'm the man I am, the woman I am today because my mama whooped me. When you say that, you are co-signing a long-standing racist narrative that says the only way to make black people civilized, healthy, intelligent, and moral people is with a good whooping and through violence. We have to stop agreeing with massa. We have to be willing to do what W.E.B. Du Bois did. See, a lot of people think of W.E.B. Du Bois and they think, oh, the talented 10th, Mr. Bourgeois, whatever. But we have to be willing to do what he did during the Atlanta riots in the early part of the 20th century. He stood outside his front door while his wife and daughter were with some buckshots. Comes here to harm my wife and my child. I was prepared to spill their guts all over the front lawn. We have to be prepared to do the exact same thing for our kids. Thank you.
I'm a young person, and I have younger brothers and sisters who I end up parenting a lot. And I never see myself like disciplining them that way. So is it that discipline that way is wrong, or physical discipline or the capital punishment, that kind of thing, is it all wrong?
Hitting, no matter how you do it, whether you do it with your hand on the backside or pick up, an extension cord or switches, it's all violence. And we have 50 years worth of science that shows even just swatting a kid on the backside can harm the growth and development of their brain. There's tons of science out there that shows it, and it lays the foundation for things like a low IQ, aggressive behavior. In girls, it can spark early puberty. So if you start hitting or even stressing out, just verbally stressing out a child as young as 2 years old, you can set that process in motion. So it's not, some people say there's a difference between, discipline and abuse. And I say the only difference is the spelling. At the end of the day, it's still violence and it still involves pain.
Yes, Roz, I didn't see you earlier today. How are you?
I just want to thank you so much for bringing this to the forefront and being so vocal in what you're doing. My name is Roz Williams. I'm with the Thriving Communities Collaborative. I just have a question in terms of what strategies you found to be most effective, because when I've had this conversation, no matter how educated people are, no matter what kinds of things I tell them, they still walk away. And I'm just curious what you found to be most effective, or what combination.
So it definitely requires a holistic approach. Number one, to let folks know, I'm never about shaming our people. I think we have to do some demystification to show them where this behavior comes from. So the first thing I do is I lay down the historical foundation. I say it doesn't start on the plantations here. It doesn't even start in West Africa. It starts 2,000 years ago in Europe, when Europeans were absolutely sadistic with their children. And you've had centuries of Europeans being destroyed by their own parents. And they brought those traumas everywhere they went, and they embedded it in every single culture. And so I show what hunter-gatherer cultures were doing prior to Europeans, what indigenous people here were doing with their kids. They weren't beating their kids. And so Europeans, with their sadism, with their racism, with their greed, with their Bibles, with their own traumas and need to dominate, that taught us how to do this to begin with. And people are absolutely floored when you lay out that history. And so then I bring them forward through the history. But then I also talk about the numbers. I say, this is what the data looks like. I talk about the rise of the carceral state in the late 19th century for all the people who believe that beating our kids is going to keep cops from, killing them or locking us up. This is what they do. This is what white supremacy requires, right? So I talk about that. And then what I find folks being most receptive to is the science, is, showing them what happens underneath your child's flesh when you hit them. So a lot of parents will see the crying, they'll hear it, or they'll say, stop or I'll give you something to cry about, and how destructive that is to deny your children their authentic emotions, right? And then I talk about how the actual physiological process that happens. So you hit your kid's not crying anymore, but you don't see the biochemical reactions that are going on in your child's body even hours later, how the liver, the stomach, the adrenal glands. All of these things are activated for hours later and what that does over time. And I talk about how spanking a child leads to other chronic health issues like diabetes, like obesity, like high blood pressure, those sorts of things. So all the people who were like, well, I got whooped and I turned out fine. I said, that statement right there is a sign that your brain has been damaged, okay?
Hello, my name is Daryl, and I appreciate this setting. This is the second time I've been in a setting like this, and it's a little uncomfortable for me because it's in a church, but it was two references that I want to bring up. One that Brother David mentioned that all tie into religion. One thing the young lady said was preachers need to stop teaching beating the children. They've been teaching this forever. Just like they've been teaching somebody's coming back to rescue us. And you just said, nobody's coming back. So my question to you is, if these are things that are staples in the black community, I mean, I'm surprised that I haven't gotten a fork or a knife thrown at me right now because it's involving Jesus and religion. And usually when you bring that up in a setting like this, black people you're pretty much dead if they could kill you. So I just want to know what your thoughts is about this, because recently I've had a whole new awakening. I was in church for 30 years, and I want to be honest when I say I want nothing to do with a church or Christians, because it brings about a mindset. And I just want to know your insight on this, especially since I've heard two comments from two different people that says something about this religion.
I don't know why y'all told me to go first, but here's what I will say. If we're going to win, institution building is critically important. And when we talk about institution building within the context of these presentations, what both Brother Larry and Dr. Stacey talked about have to be woven into what are the kinds of life-giving, life-sustaining institutions that we need to create in our community. And the reason why I say that is because whether it's the church or the public schools, these organizations are not helping us win. Now, we can always identify X number of churches in the city that are doing good work, X number of schools that are doing good work, but our response has to be collective. Our response has to be collective in terms of massive mobilization. And I think, the larger question that we got to ask ourselves is, even going back to the schools, it's not working, y'all. And I'm not indicting folks that work in the school. I'm just saying it's not working. It amazes me in a city of Baltimore with so many super talented folk that we only have one African-centered school in Baltimore, in Seroma. We only got one African-centered school in Baltimore. Why do I say that? Because when we look at the data, when we look at the evidence, there has to be, we got to build our own schools, y'all. And I know that's an alien proposal to a lot of us. If the product is not working, they just told us in the Sun paper, whether you like the Sun paper or not, that 8 schools, not a child in those schools is proficient in reading and math in the entire school. And and they only said to us that it's only 8. It's probably about 78. And so we got to ask ourselves as a people, why do we continue to support an inferior product? And then as Dr. Bunley talked about, they recycle superintendents. Do y'all know what the shelf life of an urban superintendent is? 3 to 5 years. They got contracts a lot of times like basketball players. You go to Baltimore, you stay for 3 years, you move around, you try to get a few things done. You're going to leave with a nice severance package. You take off a year, then you go to Detroit. You stay in Detroit for 3 years, you do what you can do, you get a severance package, then you go to Chicago. If the product isn't working, y'all, why do we keep supporting it? Last thing I'm going to say before I pass the mic. In Baltimore City, 76% of young people who graduate from the Baltimore City Public Schools, who matriculate to institutions of higher learning, have to take remedial courses.
On the religion question, on Christianity, black people will not get free until we find the courage to reject our oppressor's God.
Say it again, say it again, say it again.
I have a request to repeat that.
And say it real slow.
Black people will not get free until we find the courage to reject our oppressor's God. And what does that mean? What does that mean? And this is how I've dealt with it. Now, I've done work in plenty of black churches. I'm not a Christian, okay? It's totally contrary to my spirit. And I see the ways in which historically Christianity helped get black people further and further away from their roots. And so when I talk about this, even in churches, I ask folks, how did we come to Christianity? How did we get here? And what were we before this? What could we be? What could we reinvent ourselves as without it, right? And so I just lay out the historical facts. So the majority, I would say actually, if any good history, and I know the historiography because I'm a trained historian, any historian will tell you that the people who disembarked from those West African coasts were not Christians. And then they'll say things like, oh, but Egypt and Ethiopia, that's another part of the continent. And that is not the bastardized version of Christianity that we're practicing today. Okay? And so I have to take them through the history. I say we were not reading Bibles until Europeans came to West Africa and taught us that stuff, right? And even for the first 100 years, the majority were either Muslims or they were practicing traditional practices, worshiping black women, Orishas. But we came to love white Jesus more than black Orishas. And so the first 100 years that we were here in this country, our ancestors, our enslaved ancestors, did not practice Christianity. Actually, white slave owners were resistant to converting Africans to Christianity because they didn't want them to get filled up with the idea that salvation and all the other really good things that you can find in the Bible applied to them. So it wasn't until the Great Awakening that you saw a significant conversion of black people into Christianity. So we've only been practicing Christianity in significant numbers for a little over 250 years. That's it. And so when they cherry pick Bible verses like spare the rod, I say, do you know Hebrew? What is the Hebrew interpretation of rod? It's a symbol. It's a walking stick. It's about guidance. Right? And then the same people are conspicuously silent about Proverbs, which talks about using a rod to beat adults. And so then I'm like, okay, since you want to have this literal interpretation, why don't we bring back sacrificing kids, drowning them? Why don't we make our sons who lie to us go out into the public square and be stoned to death by the neighbors? Why don't we make our daughters marry their rapists? Why don't we do that then? Bring it all back. Or we could move to the New Testament and talk about the ways in which Jesus treated kids. If you must practice Christianity, let's talk about what Jesus did. He welcomed children with coddling and snuggling and soft hands. He said we need to emulate the nature of children. You can't be a follower of Jesus Christ and beat children. So you just lay out the historical facts. Now, contrary to what my brother is feeling over there, I haven't given up on black churches. I am not naive to think that we will abandon this religion. no matter how toxic it is to us. So I decide to come to the churches. And I say, look, Reverend so-and-so, let me show you a map of the city. Here's where your church is. Now let me show you all of the confirmed rates of child abuse. And here are all the fatalities. Here's what school suspensions and expulsions look like. Here's all of these other problems. And we interviewed some of people in your church on parenting attitudes. And we know that you preach spare the rod, spoil the child. And we have last year a dozen parents in your church that were arrested. And they all said, spare the rod, spoil the child. So we have to make the connection between what's going on behind the pulpit and what's happening in our streets.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have to keep this moving. Dr. Patton, thank you so much. Larry Simmons, appreciate you. David Miller. David, what did you say? Don't call you anymore? You're not going to any more meetings? Okay.